What happens when family lines cross too closely? When cousins marry cousins, not once, but for generations? When siblings, isolated from the world, become partners? These questions are not relics of medieval Europe or distant folklore. They are the unsettling reality for some American families today. In the remote hills of West Virginia, the town of Odd stands as a living testament to the consequences of consanguinity. Here, isolation is not just a geographical feature, but a social reality. Outsiders are rare, and tradition often outweighs caution. In this setting, Gracie Irene Whitaker was born around 1920. A child already carrying a double dose of shared DNA. Her parents were first cousins, and their parents were twin brothers, compounding the genetic overlap. Gracie's story did not end with her birth. She later married her double cousin, John Emery Whitaker, a man nearly as genetically close as a sibling. In this Appalachian enclave, such unions were expected, not questioned. Together, Gracie and John had 15 children. The legacy of repeated inbreeding manifested in unmistakable ways. Most of their children never learned to speak. Many could not read or write. Several bore visible congenital defects, misaligned eyes, distorted facial features, and uncoordinated motor functions. At least one child could only communicate in grunts. The local community whispered, using words like off or touched, but no one intervened. In early 20th century backwoods West Virginia, poverty and isolation meant medical records were scarce, and genetic testing was non-existent. The pattern, however, became undeniable as the children grew. Generations of consanguinity had compounded, and Gracie's children bore the cost in both body and mind. Despite these challenges, Gracie never left Odd. She lived and died in the same house, surrounded by the family she created, many of whom could barely function independently. She never spoke to the press. No outsider truly knew her thoughts. Yet, through her children, Gracie became the living center of one of the most extreme cases of familial inbreeding ever documented in the United States. Some of her descendants still inhabit the same land, their lives shaped by a legacy of genetic isolation. Gracie Whitaker's name may be unknown to most Americans, but her story endures in the faces, voices, and silences of those she left behind. The consequences of consanguinity are not limited to physical deformities. Intellectual disability, delayed development, and profound communication barriers are recurring themes. These are not myths or urban legends, but documented realities, sometimes hidden by families, sometimes uncovered by medical professionals or social workers. The genetic toll of repeated inbreeding becomes tragically clear. When the same genes meet again and again, nature cannot correct the course. The result is a closed loop, a world where silence replaces speech, and potential is stifled before it can bloom. This is not a story about blame or judgment. It is a sober account of what happens when tradition, isolation, and lack of genetic awareness intersect. The story of Gracie and her family is a warning, one that remains relevant as similar cases continue to surface across America. As genetic testing becomes more accessible, the hidden costs of consanguinity are coming to light, challenging communities to confront uncomfortable truths about heritage, health, and the future of their children. Laureen Whitaker's life began and ended in the same remote Appalachian home where her mother Gracie was born. But Lorraine's story is not simply a continuation. It is a deepening of the genetic spiral that defined the Whitaker family. Born in the 1940s, Lorraine was the daughter of Gracie and John Emery Whitaker, themselves double cousins. In her, the same strands of DNA, already compressed by generations of consanguinity, circled back upon themselves once more. From infancy, Lorraine's differences were unmistakable. She did not speak. Her eyes struggled to track movement, and her muscles were weak, rendering her gait unsteady and her movements uncoordinated. Unlike other children, Lorraine never learned to read or write, nor did she ever attend a formal school. Her world was bounded by the family's isolated property, a closed loop from which she rarely, if ever, emerged. Neighbors, those few who lived close enough to observe, referred to Lorraine as slow or simple. Yet these words failed to capture the depth of her challenges. In reality, Lorraine exhibited severe intellectual disability, a likely result of the repeated genetic overlap in her ancestry. Decades later, genetic testing on surviving relatives would confirm what medical professionals suspected. The Whitaker bloodline had reached a critical tipping point, with congenital defects and cognitive delays manifesting in nearly every generation. Lorraine's existence was marked by silence and routine. She never married, never held a job, and never lived independently. Most of her daily interactions were limited to family members who shared similar conditions, siblings and cousins whose lives were likewise shaped by the consequences of consanguinity. The family's isolation, both geographic and social, meant that no formal diagnosis was ever made. No government agency intervened. In the mid-20th century Appalachian backwoods, families like the Whitakers existed on the margins, largely invisible to the outside world. The absence of intervention was not merely a failure of the healthcare system, but a reflection of broader societal neglect. In rural West Virginia, poverty and isolation were the norm. Medical records were rare, and genetic counseling was unheard of. The Whitakers' story, like those of many similar families, unfolded in silence, unnoticed, unaddressed, and ultimately unrecorded by the wider society. By the time Lorraine died, likely in her 40s or 50s, there was no obituary, no public record of her passing. Her life ended as it had been lived, quietly, within the confines of the family property, surrounded by relatives who shared her fate. Another life, shaped and limited by a bloodline that kept circling itself. Her story might have vanished entirely, but in the fragments that remain, we see the real cost of what happens when the same genes meet over and over again. Lorraine's life is not an isolated tragedy, but a stark illustration of the consequences of unchecked consanguinity. Her story, and those like hers, serve as a somber warning. When tradition and isolation combine to perpetuate close-kin unions, the resulting genetic risks are not abstract. They are embodied in the lives of real people, whose potential is stifled before it can unfold. The legacy of the Whitaker family is a testament to the urgent need for awareness, intervention, and compassion in communities where the past continues to shape the future in silence. Rita's story begins not in a hospital, but in a hidden room in rural Texas, a place where secrets fester and the truth is slow to surface. Born around 2010, Rita entered the world small, frail, and struggling to breathe. Her mother was a teenager, and her father was not just a parent, but also her mother's father. This was not a case of distant cousins or even siblings. It was direct, first-degree incest, a genetic scenario that triggers the most severe consequences. Doctors were immediately concerned. Rita's facial structure was unusual, her heartbeat irregular, and she bore unexplained bruises. Routine examinations failed to explain her condition. Only after a full genetic test did the devastating truth emerge. Massive regions of identical DNA, the unmistakable signature of a father-daughter union. The results were catastrophic. Rita was born with multiple congenital defects, neurological damage, a rare heart defect, and a cleft lip that required surgery in her first year. She developed hydrocephalus, a buildup of fluid in the brain, and needed a shunt to relieve the pressure. As she grew, it became clear she would never speak. She was not simply delayed, she was nonverbal, with severely limited motor control and profound intellectual disability. The consequences of such extreme consanguinity are well documented in medical literature. When first-degree relatives conceive a child, the risk of serious congenital defects and intellectual disability skyrockets. Rita's life became a case study in these risks, a living example of what happens when the boundaries of biology are crossed in the most dangerous way. By the age of 4, Rita's world had shifted dramatically. Both her biological parents were in prison, the law having intervened where the community had not. Her mother tried to justify the relationship as love, but the state saw it for what it was: child abuse, perpetuated and passed down another generation. Rita became a ward of the state, placed in a long-term care facility in Houston. Now a teenager, she remains nonverbal, requiring full-time care and constant therapy. Her future is uncertain, her dependency total. The cycle of abuse had become biology, and Rita's body and mind bear the cost. Rita's case is not folklore or a cautionary tale from the past. It is a recent, real, and ongoing tragedy. Her story is a stark reminder that the consequences of incest are not just legal or moral, but biological, written into the very fabric of a child's being. The medical community recognizes that such cases, though rare, are often hidden, surfacing only when the effects are too severe to ignore. Yet, even in the shadow of tragedy, there are stories that offer a different perspective. Maria was born in the mid-1970s in a Hutterite colony in South Dakota, a closed, deeply religious community where endogamy was a tradition, not a scandal. Her parents were second cousins, and intermarriage within the group was common, seen as cultural continuity rather than risk. At birth, Maria displayed signs of Treacher-Collins syndrome, a recessed chin, misshapen ears, and a cleft palate. While this genetic disorder is not exclusive to inbreeding, its prevalence is heightened in isolated populations. Unlike many others, Maria's mind was unaffected. Though her hearing was impaired, she learned to read, to sign, and to participate in the small school system of her colony. The Hutterite community did not ostracize her. Instead, they cared for her, emphasizing support for the weak. Maria underwent surgeries, wore a hearing aid, and eventually became a caregiver for younger children. Her case was documented in medical journals, not as a tragedy, but as a nuanced example of the risks and resilience found in genetically isolated communities. Maria's life demonstrates that consanguinity does not always end in disaster, but it always carries risk. Her face bears the imprint of her ancestry, but her story is one of survival and adaptation, a testament to the difference that community support and medical care can make. In Houston, Texas, the story of Linda unfolds, a narrative shaped by the intersection of tradition and genetic science. Born in 2011 to parents who were first cousins, Linda's life began within a community of recent immigrants from the Middle East, where cousin marriage is not only accepted, but often encouraged. For Linda's parents, their union was a continuation of cultural heritage, not a deviation. Yet, As Linda's early months passed, it became clear that genetics are indifferent to cultural norms. Linda was born slightly premature, exhibiting muscle weakness and feeding difficulties. Subtle physical differences, features that might escape the untrained eye, prompted concern among her physicians. As developmental delays became more pronounced, genetic testing was ordered. The results were unambiguous. Linda's parents shared a significant amount of identical DNA, consistent with a first-cousin pairing. This dramatically increased the risk of autosomal recessive disorders, and Linda's case was a textbook example. She was diagnosed with a missing kidney, experienced frequent seizures, and struggled with speech. Her head circumference remained unusually small, a condition known as microcephaly. By age 6, Linda's learning capacity lagged far behind her peers, and she was placed in a specialized classroom for children with intellectual disabilities. The emotional toll on Linda's family was profound. Her parents, though deeply committed, were overwhelmed by the demands of her care. They told doctors they had never been warned about the genetic risks of cousin marriage. For them, Linda's condition was interpreted as fate, God's will, rather than a preventable outcome. Their experience reflects a broader reality. In many communities across the United States, tradition and science are on a collision course, and children like Linda are caught in the middle. Linda's story is not unique. As genetic testing becomes more accessible, more cases are being documented in communities where consanguinity remains common. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, children born to first cousins have a risk of congenital defects that is 2 to 3 times higher than the general population. Yet, cultural acceptance can obscure these risks, and families may not receive adequate counseling or support. Despite her challenges, Linda's journey is one of resilience. At 14, she attends school part-time and participates in therapy sessions nearly every week. She can speak in simple sentences, though reading and writing remain difficult. Her IQ hovers around 70, functionally limited but not nonverbal. She lives at home, heavily reliant on her parents for daily support. Her story is a testament to the power of family commitment, but also a reminder of the hidden costs of tradition when it conflicts with genetic reality. The case of Linda underscores the urgent need for culturally sensitive genetic counseling and public health outreach. It is not about blame, but about bridging the gap between heritage and health. As America's population grows increasingly diverse, the intersection of tradition and biology will become an even more pressing issue. Linda's life, shaped by both love and genetics, calls for compassion, awareness, and action. Her story, like those of Gracie, Lorene, Rita, and Maria, is not merely a cautionary tale. It is a call to recognize the realities of consanguinity, not as a relic of the past, but as a living issue that demands understanding and intervention. In Linda's quiet determination and her family's unwavering care, there is both a warning and a hope for a future where knowledge and compassion guide the choices that shape generations. The story of consanguinity in America does not end with individual families or isolated tragedies. Instead, it points to a broader, deeply rooted tension between tradition, science, and the evolving fabric of society. In communities across the United States, rural and urban, native-born and immigrant, the legacy of close kin unions continues to shape lives, often in silence, sometimes in suffering. Medical research is unequivocal. Children born to first cousins face a risk of congenital defects that is 2 to 3 times higher than the general population. When consanguinity is repeated over generations, as seen in the Whitaker family, the compounding effect can be devastating. Intellectual disability, congenital heart defects, microcephaly, and a host of rare genetic syndromes are not just statistical possibilities, they become lived realities. These conditions do not discriminate by geography, ethnicity, or faith. They are the result of biology, indifferent to custom or belief. Yet, for many families, the choice to marry within the bloodline is not made lightly or with ignorance. In some cultures, cousin marriage is a tradition that signifies trust, continuity, and familial stability. For recent immigrants such as Linda's family in Houston, the practice is woven into the fabric of their identity. But as Linda's case demonstrates, tradition alone cannot shield against the laws of genetics. Her parents, overwhelmed by the demands of her care, expressed regret that no one had warned them of the risks. Their story is echoed in communities from Appalachia to the Dakotas, where isolation or cultural norms have perpetuated consanguinity for generations. The consequences are not merely medical. Families often find themselves navigating a labyrinth of stigma, misunderstanding, and inadequate support. In the Whitaker case, neighbors whispered but did not intervene. In Rita's story, the law intervened only after the damage was done. For Maria, community support made a difference. But her experience is the exception, not the rule. Too often the burden falls on mothers, caring for children with profound needs, facing judgment, and living with questions that may never be answered. In recent years, advances in genetic testing and counseling have begun to illuminate the hidden toll of inbreeding. More cases are being documented, and public health agencies are starting to respond. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, along with genetic counselors nationwide, now recommend targeted outreach in communities where consanguinity remains prevalent. The goal is not to condemn tradition, but to provide knowledge, support, and options, empowering families to make informed choices for their children's futures. Still, the path forward is fraught with challenges. The intersection of heritage and science is sensitive terrain. Public health messages must be delivered with cultural competence and respect, not judgment or coercion. The stories of Gracie, Lorene, Rita, Maria, and Linda are not simply tales of tragedy. They are calls to action. They urge us to recognize the reality of consanguinity in modern America, to listen without prejudice, and to respond with both compassion and evidence-based care. Ultimately, the question remains: how do we honor tradition while protecting the next generation? The answer lies not in silence or shame, but in open dialogue, education, and the courage to bridge the gap between past and future. The legacy of consanguinity is written in the lives of those who bear its marks. Their stories demand that we see, understand, and act, not only for their sake, but for the generations yet to come.